Scotland is divided into three distinctive regions. The Highlands, a broad swathe of granite mountains dominating the west and north of the country. The central lowlands, possessing the richest farmlands and the bulk of the population and industry. And the southern uplands, a remote moorland region straddling the border with England. Each region has exercised powerful influences over the railway network, which varies from remote mountain lines to the industrial networks around Glasgow and Edinburgh. This variety was once mirrored in the motive power types which once worked the railways of Scotland. In this programme, we will look at Scottish steam power at work throughout the country, from the early 1960s right through to the present day. The city of Glasgow, dominating the system in much the same way as London dominates the English network. The city once possessed 4 termini. Buchanan Street was one of these, and saw a variety of traffic, including expresses bound for the East Coast and Aberdeen. During the 1960s, the station played host to the Gresley A4 Pacifics, displaced by dieselization on the East Coast Main Line. "6019 Bittern was later destined for preservation. She's seen here backing onto an Aberdeen-bound train on the 15th of July, 1965. A little over a year later, this station was to close, with the services transferred to Queen Street. Ironically, the run to Aberdeen was perhaps more suited to the A4s than the East Coast Main Line. The trains were mostly light, and the route itself possessed only short gradients, allowing the A4s to run at high speeds. In 1965, when these scenes were taken, the expresses to Aberdeen ran along the former Caledonian route via Forfar. This line closed during September 1967, and through trains were diverted via Dundee. After the middle of 1963, there was little work for the A4s on the East Coast Main Line. Some were withdrawn, but a number were transferred to Scotland, where they enjoyed an Indian summer on the tightly timed 3-hour Glasgow to Aberdeen expresses. These scenes show the A4s in and around Aberdeen Ferry Hill Shed. Gradually, the A-Force fell by the wayside, until by September 1966, the last of the class was withdrawn, and an era for these magnificent Pacifics brought to a close. Scotland also provided a home for other Pacifics displaced from the East Coast Line. By July 1965, 60052 Prince Palatine was one of only 2 Gresley A3s remaining in service. She's seen here at Dundee and went on to be the last of the class withdrawn in January of 1966. The last of the Peppercorn A2s also ended their days in Scotland. 2 of the last 3 surviving engines are seen at Dundee during June 1965. Blue Peter was kept a standby engine at Dundee until as late as December 1966. South of the border, the last years of steam were dominated by a few standard classes. Here in Scotland, some pre-grouping classes were still at work right up until the very end. This J-37 worked at Dundee, acting as the shed pilot. Another surviving pre-grouping class was this classic North British J-36. Many of the class served overseas with the ROD and received names connected with the First World War, including the preserved Maud. So, in the 1960s, Scotland still possessed a remarkable collection of classes, varying from pre-grouping locomotives right through to the standard designs. Black Fives were seen in action throughout Scotland. They were to prove capable performers on anything from expresses to freight, and were regularly used on the West Highland and Northern lines after nationalisation. These scenes were taken at Perth in 1965. The VR Clan Pacifics were designed as replacements for the Jubilees, but turned out to be the least successful of the standard classes. Only 10 were built, and were always associated with Scottish sheds. They never proved powerful enough for the Highland main line for which they were intended. 72006 Clan Mackenzie is seen here heading south from Perth with a parcels train in 1965. This locomotive was the last survivor of the class, being withdrawn in 1966. The standard class 5s were also common in Scotland. The standard designs were introduced throughout Scotland after nationalisation, serving to add to the wide variety of classes at work on the Lowland network. At the same time, an extensive secondary and branch line system existed throughout the country. The line from Dunblane to Culin was once part of a through line to Crianlarich and the West Highland lines. When these scenes were taken in April 1965, the line was operated by standard 264 tanks. These locomotives were introduced in 1961. Before that date, motive power had been provided by ex-Caledonian 044 tank engines. The line originally ran a further mile to a terminus at Loch Tay. This section was closed to passenger traffic in 1939, and trains terminated here at Killin. The station was not provided with a passing loop, so gravity shunting was used to run round the single coach. The branch was to remain a bastion of steam operation right through to the very end, with only the occasional DMU appearing in the 1960s on special excursion traffic. But the days of the Scottish branch were drawing to a close. On the 28th of September 1965, this delightful route was to be prematurely closed by a rock slide further along the line at Glen Oglehead. In 1965, the Highland Railway celebrated its centenary, and to mark the occasion, the Scottish region introduced a week of runs between Inverness and Elgin, using Jones Goods 460 number 103. From this date, the total number of steam locomotives declined rapidly, although variety remained right up to the very end. These scenes were taken during March 1966 at Perth. By the end of 1966, all steam working based on depots in Scotland finally came to an end. For the next few months, some Britannia-hauled trains ventured north of the border from the shed at Carlisle. By the summer of 1967, even these had ended, and all steam working in Scotland finally came to an end. But if one era had ended, another was soon to start. Of the entire class of 35 A4s, 6 have been preserved. And of these, 6 0009 Union of South Africa is the most closely associated with Scotland. In the 1960s, a group of businessmen formed the Lochte Private Railway. Soon they had relayed 3 miles of this former freight-only branch. It was on to this that 6 0009 was moved soon after her withdrawal in 1967. Remarkably, the engine was to remain in original BR condition, with the livery remaining intact. Then, in 1972, the engine finally made it back onto the main line. During September 1973, she ran north to Inverness to take part in the Highland Rail Fair. At this time, the Deltics were still in traffic on the East Coast main line, and one of the class made its way north to share in the event. After the event, 60009 made her way south along the Highland Main Line from Inverness to Perth. This rare working was to be the first over this section since dieselisation in the early 1960s. That day, Aviemore would play host to two generations of East Coast Main Line motive power as the Deltic worked past the A4 at the head of a charter train. In the early 1980s, 60009 was to work a series of specials on very familiar routes. During this period, she would work to Aberdeen, Dundee and Edinburgh. Then, in 1985, the locomotive headed south of the border for a spell of duty over the Settle and Carlisle. This view is, perhaps more than any other, reminiscent of the days of steam on the East Coast Main Line. The station at York provides a backdrop as the A4 departs on a special bound for Carlisle. 60009 is seen here during Easter 1985 on the Settle and Carlisle approaching Burkitt Common. During the steam era, Royal Scots and Jubilees were regular performers on this route. Then, towards the end of steam, the A3s saw service. However, it wasn't until the Preservation era that A4s were seen regularly in the form of Sir Nigel Gresley, and in 1985, by this example, Union of South Africa. The last of Gresley's V2s also saw out their days in Scotland. During the summer of 1987, Dundee once more echoed to the syncopated beat of a V2 with a visit from the preserved Green Arrow. The Scottish lowlands present a gentle landscape of grassy hills and green dales. Altogether, this region supports nearly all of Scotland's industry and 2/3 of her population. But to the north and west, there is an abrupt change of landscape. The Highlands possess some of the greatest scenic splendor in the British Isles. These mountains share the landscape with a labyrinth of sea lochs and wooded glens, and above them lies an ever-changing sky. Remarkably, the Highlands cover a quarter of the land area of Britain, and yet possess only a 50th of the population. The railway here reflects this remoteness, with long stretches of single track winding a lonely course through the region. There are two lines serving the West Highlands: the Mountain Line serving Fort William with branches from Crianlarich to Oban and from Fort William to Mallaig. Such an area did not suit steam operation, coal was not available locally, and dieselization came in the early 1960s. Since then, a handful of diesels, in latter years Class 37s, have worked the system. Of the steam era, few records remain. Poor communications and the remoteness of the region discouraged all but the hardiest of photographers. But in 1984, all that was to change. For the first time in a generation, the Highlands would once again reverberate to the sound of steam. The first specials were to be hauled by a class of locomotive closely associated with the West Highland Line. Black 5, number 5305, is seen returning tender first alongside Loch Elt during the summer of 1985. There is, perhaps, no depot on British railways surrounded by such grandeur as Fort William. To the east, the site is dominated by Ben Nevis, Britain's highest mountain, at 4,406 feet. The 1987 season would mark the introduction of new motive power in the form of an ex-LNER K1. During LNER and early BR days, moguls were indelibly associated with the West Highland Line. Starting with the two-cylinder K2s in the 20s, a special three-cylinder type, the K4, was developed for this line. In 1945, one of the K4s was rebuilt with only two cylinders and became the prototype for the K1 class, to which this engine, number 2005, belongs. She's actually an imposter in green, entering service in BR Black as 62005. The K1s worked on the West Highland from 1954 to the end of steam. We'll now follow the K1 on its journey from Fort William to Mallaig during July 1987. We're approaching the first of the stations at Banavi. Beyond the station, the line crosses the Caledonian Canal on a swing bridge. Soon the line begins a steady climb into the surrounding mountains, eventually reaching Glenfinnan Viaduct. This structure has the distinction of being Britain's first concrete bridge. Its 21 arches carry the line on a U-shaped profile across the valley at the head of Loch Shiel. Once beyond the viaduct, the grade steepens to 1 in 50, climbing towards the station at Glenfinnan. Railways came late to the Western Highlands. This section was completed in 1901 and serves the Isle of Skye via the port of Mallaig. Closure was threatened in the 1960s under the beaching plan. Fortunately, the remoteness of the region and the difficulties of securing alternative transport saved the day. We are now at the second of the passing loops at Arisaig. Once beyond the station, the line descends on grades of 1 in 50 towards the coast. Now we're within sight of a cocktail of islands dominating the approaches to Mallaig: Rum, Egg, Canna, and of course the Isle of Skye. The terminus at Mallaig, a lonely 42 miles from Fort William and a further 160 miles from the main network at Glasgow. Separating Fort William and the lowlands to the south stand the highest of the Grampian Mountains. This barrier is crossed by a magnificently scenic and steeply graded line running via the summits at Corroor and Tindrum. On a blustery October the 16th, Black 5, number 5305, set out along this route on the long journey to Glasgow. For the first time in a generation, the valleys to the north of Ben Nevis would reverberate to the sound of steam. The 2,948-foot summit of Ben Durian dominates the famous horseshoe curve between Bridge of Orchy and the summit near Tindrum. In order to reach the summit without the need for a costly viaduct, the railway clings to the lower slopes of 3 mountains. Its route carries it on grades of 1 in 60, lifting the line 400 feet into the surrounding mountains. At 2 p.m. on the 16th of October, the Black 5, dwarfed by the lower slopes of Ben Durian, approaches the horseshoe curve. From this point, the train is hidden from view as she begins the ascent round the curve. For the next 10 minutes, 5305 will continue to climb before appearing near the approaches to the summit. We'll now follow the progress of the locomotive from a camera position inside the curve, as the train describes a 180-degree arc around us. We're now about to leave the horseshoe curve, and from a position near the summit, we'll see the Black 5 on the final leg of the climb. Such a spectacular event was to generate intense interest. By the time the train had reached the summit, the road was jammed by hundreds of cars. After the stop at Crianlarich, the Black 5 headed towards Glasgow. The following month, on the 14th of November, the K1 was to follow the Black 5 on the route south to Glasgow. The train is seen here at Tulloch in conditions rather untypical of this part of the Western Highlands. For the first time in 24 years, the line from Fort William to Glasgow was to play host to steam-hauled trains. Elsewhere in Scotland, the age of steam finished in the late 60s. The sight of A4s and A2s on express traffic has now passed into history. Yet, despite this, steam remains a regular sight in other areas, and, ironically, those lines which dispensed with steam traction in the early 60s have today been the first to host the regular running of specials.